Welcome to the Maybe Not So Great Books channel, you decide. Today, The Fourth Turning by Neil Howe and William Strauss. The best-selling prophecy that predicted 9/11, COVID, and the death of institutional trust. Endorsed by Al Gore, Newt Gingrich, and Steve Bannon. 3 decades, 3 books, 0 peer review. But is it actually good? Can a theory with no scientific support, endorsed by political operators, and revised every time it fails, still teach us something real about how history works? My position going into this is that we are looking at an an unfalsifiable horoscope. It's designed to sell corporate consulting, built by an entertainer and a policy wonk with 0 peer-reviewed validation. When you actually look at the data, the methodology, and the massive timeline revisions, the entire architecture just collapses into self-serving mythology.
I take a very different view in the material. And yes, there are structural flaws. The authors absolutely lack a traditional academic pedigree. We can and should talk about that. But despite those issues, this framework successfully diagnosed the decay of institutional trust decades before it was obvious to the mainstream. When you understand how they are applying their concepts, it remains a profoundly useful, accurate lens for understanding how shared cohort experiences shape history.
Let's test that accuracy right out of the gate, because I want to start with what I call the goalpost migration. This theory is famous for its predictive claims, right? In 1997, in their book, The Fourth Turning, Strauss and Howe made a very explicit, testable prediction about the upcoming crisis era. They wrote that this crisis would resolve, and, I quote directly here, sometime before the year 2025. They explicitly stated America would pass through a great gate in history by that exact date. Fast forward to the 2023 solo follow-up by Neil Howe, The Fourth Turning is here. Suddenly, he quietly shifts the resolution to the mid-2030s. There is no explicit admission of a correction in the text. He just moves the deadline. A prediction with a 20-year timeline that misses by a full decade, which is a 50% error rate, is not a prophecy. It is a moving target designed to never be proven wrong. Unfalsifiability is the absolute hallmark of pseudoscience.
You are looking at this like a train schedule, but history operates more like seasons, which is the core metaphor of their entire framework. When you are modeling macro-historical cycles, what they call the saculum, spanning roughly 80 to 100 years, a variance of a few years, or even a decade in the resolution of a massive institutional crisis is exactly what you should expect. A winter can run long. The broader claim they made in 1997 was that the period from roughly 2005 to 2025 would be defined by a massive collapse in institutional trust, immense political polarization, and a prevailing crisis mood. Tell me that was incorrect.
Anyone looking at the national debt and the beginnings of political polarization in 1997 could have guessed we would have a rough couple of decades. Predicting a bad mood or institutional friction over a 20-year window is just actuarial probability. It's not a scientific framework. But let's look at the architects of this theory, because doing a biography audit explains perfectly why this reads more like a horoscope than actual history. Let's look at Neil Howe. He grew up with an astronomer grandfather, Robert Julius Trumpler, who was devoted to rigorous mathematical observation. Yet Howe built a lucrative empire on historical astrology. He holds a terminal master's degree, meaning he stopped short of a PhD. He doesn't have the formal academic research credentials or faculty positions you would expect from a macro historian. No formal training in demography or sociology. And then there is William Strauss. He wasn't a demographer either. He was literally a comedian. In 1981, he co-founded the Tapital Steps, a political satire troupe that grew into a $3 million company with over 40 employees. Jacobin famously called him a down-market Weird Al.
Look, calling him a down-market Weird Al makes for a highly entertaining headline, but you are walking right into a genetic fallacy. We cannot dismiss the validity of a sociological framework just because one of the creators wrote political satire and the other doesn't have a PhD. In fact, that specific ability to observe human behavior, to pick up on the subtle absurdities and patterns of different demographics, is exactly what fueled their sociology. Academic history in the 1990s was incredibly dry and hyper-specialized. Strauss and Howe brought an essential outside perspective.
It is not a genetic fallacy when their background explains the exact flaws in the final product. What is a satirist's specific skill set? It is boiling down incredibly complex human behavior into flat, highly digestible archetypes for mass consumption. That is the exact rhetorical DNA of this theory. They give us these memorable, rigid labels like prophet, nomad, hero, and artist. It is high narrative drama. It's a product built for stages and boardrooms, which makes total sense considering Neil Howe now charges between $30,000 to $50,000 per speaking engagement. It's not history. It is thought leader monetization.
Okay, I will grant you that they packaged it for a mainstream audience, but you are ignoring the actual rigorous sociological utility of their work. Let's talk about the generational diagonal, because this is a legitimate analytical technique they brought into the mainstream. Before Strauss and Howe, a massive amount of public discourse committed what they call the age bracket fallacy, which is assuming all teenagers in any era act a certain way, or the life course fallacy, assuming everyone's life cycle dictates the exact same political beliefs. What they demonstrated is that if you read history diagonally, tracing a specific birth cohort as they age through time, mysteries suddenly dissolve. Karl Mannheim laid all of this out back in 1923. He established the foundational idea that if you experience a trauma like a world war at age 18, it wires your brain entirely differently than if you experience it at age 40. Strauss and Howe didn't invent that concept, but they operationalized it brilliantly.
I understand the theory of cohort analysis, but we need to look at how they actually applied it empirically. Give me an example of their diagonal method solving a real mystery.
The most famous example is the massive 17-year decline in SAT scores that happened from 1963 to 1980. At the time, politicians and school boards were panicking. Everyone blamed failing schools, bad teachers, or lack of funding. But Strauss and Howe looked at the generational diagonal. They pointed out that it wasn't the schools fundamentally changing, it was a completely different cohort personality. The transition from the compliant silent generation to the more rebellious, less institutionally focused baby boomers moving through adolescence. The same exact pattern explains the sudden spike in crime data and substance abuse data in the 1980s and 90s. Reading data by birth cohort rather than static age brackets is completely foundational to developmental psychology today. Even their fiercest academic critics do not dispute the sheer value of that cohort analysis.
I won't dispute the value of cohort analysis broadly, but we have to look at how catastrophically Strauss and Howe misapplied it in their own books. You're praising their data analysis, so let's unpack the famous Fairfax County flaw. This is arguably their most glaring methodological sin, and it undermines their entire modern predictive model. They defined the traits of the entire millennial generation, a cohort of 80 million people, as team-oriented, rule-following, and institutionally trusting. Where exactly did they get that profile?
They utilized extensive survey data from high school students in the late 1990s to project those attitudes.
Let's be specific about that data. They surveyed about 600 affluent teenagers from Fairfax County, Virginia. For anyone unfamiliar, Fairfax County is routinely ranked as one of the richest, most highly educated counties in America. They took the survey results of wealthy, predominantly white suburban kids and extrapolated those exact traits to tens of millions of incredibly diverse Americans across the entire socioeconomic spectrum. That is not generational analysis. That is class analysis poorly disguised as generational destiny. A Black millennial growing up in rural Alabama and a wealthy white millennial in Fairfax County do not share a unified peer personality just because they happen to be born in the same calendar year. The National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine published a massive report in 2020, explicitly stating that categorizing workers with these generational labels is fundamentally unsupported by rigorous research.
Bias in that specific instance. Fairfax County was obviously not a representative sample of the entire nation, and their early optimism about millennials was heavily colored by the economic boom of the late 1990s when they were writing. But you are throwing the baby out with the bathwater here. Even if the archetype labels sometimes drift into caricatures, which, by the way, they explicitly admitted in the appendices of their 1991 book Generations, the overarching pattern of institutional trust oscillation is brilliantly observed and highly accurate.
Let's test that observation. Walk me through exactly how their model accurately diagnosed institutional trust.
Look at their concept of the unraveling, which they define as the third turning. Long before it was conventional wisdom, they correctly diagnosed how the post-World War II consensus would inevitably decay. They looked at the Treaty of Detroit. For anyone unfamiliar, that's basically the 1950s era where massive corporations and labor unions effectively shook hands to build the suburban middle class. It was an era of extremely high institutional trust. Strauss and Howe mapped exactly how that cohesion would devolve into the extreme individualism and cultural fragmentation of the 1980s and 90s. They pointed to cultural artifacts like Apple's famous 1984 Macintosh ad or the "We're spending our children's inheritance" bumper stickers that boomers put on their RVs as perfectly capturing this shift toward individualism. But more importantly, they articulated the endowment cycle.
Expand on the mechanics of that endowment cycle, because I know that essential to your defense of the theory.
The endowment cycle is the idea that when the generation that built a massive institutional framework dies, the institutional memory of why it was built dies alongside them. Think about the New Deal. The founders of the New Deal built it because they personally remembered the visceral horror and starvation of the Great Depression. They understood the stakes. But their grandchildren just look at those same institutions and see a bloated, inefficient bureaucracy because they never felt the pain of the crisis that necessitated them. The memory fades, the trust erodes, and society cyclically loses its competencies. It's an incredibly profound insight into why our modern institutions are currently failing. They don't fail because people are suddenly evil. They fail because the living memory of the crisis has expired.
It's an eloquent observation, I'll give you that. But it does not require an 80-year clock or 4 rigid mystical archetypes to be true. It just requires basic human psychology. And when they actually tried to use their rigid framework to make specific predictions in 1997, they failed spectacularly. Let's look at the actual scorecard. They predicted one-party dominance during the upcoming crisis. Wrong. Power has alternated in Washington 5 times since 2000. They predicted declining inequality as the crisis forced wealth redistribution. Wrong. The top 10% now hold over 2/3 of the wealth. They predicted rising unionization. It fell drastically. They predicted those Fairfax County millennials would become dutiful civic heroes, comparable to the GI generation of World War II. Instead, millennials are burdened by historic debts, politically fractured, and completely disillusioned with the state.
You're demanding precision on specific policy outcomes, but the true predictive power of the theory isn't in guessing unionization rates. It is in predicting the character of the societal response based entirely on the generational constellation at the time. In Chapter 13 of their 1991 book, they proposed a brilliant thought experiment about nuclear terrorism to prove this exact point.
You're referring to the hypothetical where a bomb is smuggled into New York City?
Exactly. They asked a simple question. How does America respond to a catastrophic event? And their answer was that the event itself doesn't dictate the response. The generational lineup at the time does. Let's break it down. If this attack happens in an awakening era, which is a period of spiritual upheaval, like circa 1970, you get mass hysteria, massive institutional hubris, and an immediate generational war between the old hawks running the government and the young doves protesting in the streets. If it happens during an unraveling era, an era of weak institutions and individualism, like circa 1990, you get complete paralysis by process, endless multilateral negotiations, overlapping committees, and hyper-complicated evacuation plans that fail. But if it happens during a crisis era, like circa 2020, the response is totally different. The boomer elders would tie the event to a global moral crusade. The Gen X middle-lifers would aggressively and pragmatically manage the logistics on the ground. And the millennial youth would cooperate with disciplined obedience. The exact same event yields 3 entirely different historical outcomes based solely on who is occupying which phase of life. We saw this exact dynamic attempt to play out during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Wait, you cannot seriously use the COVID-19 response as validation for their theory. If anything, the pandemic absolutely breaks their model. They predicted millennial unity and martial cooperation in the face of a crisis. What we actually got during COVID was extreme social media fragmentation, massive resistance to public health mandates, and deepened political divisions. The great civic solidarity they promised never materialized. And the boomers, they didn't act as unifying gray champions guiding the youth. They drove partisan polarization to new, toxic heights. Which brings me directly to the endorsers of this theory, because we have to talk about who actually benefits from this narrative. Al Gore and Newt Gingrich absolutely loved this framework in the 1990s. Do you know why?
Because it offered a bipartisan, macro-historical lens to understand the gridlock they were experiencing.
No, because it flattered them. It told the baby boomer generation that they were the ultimate protagonists of history. It cast them in the archetype of the prophet, destined to become the wise gray champions who would provide the moral absolutism required to guide society through its darkest hour. It is a wildly self-serving boomer prophecy written by two boomers. But the endorser privilege goes much, much darker than Gore and Gingrich. We have to stop here and look at the actual text, because this isn't just a harmless corporate horoscope. There is a deeply concerning political application here. We have to talk about Steve Bannon.
That is a highly controversial connection, and we should be very clear up front that an author cannot control who reads their book or how it is eventually applied in the chaotic political arena.
That would be a fair defense if Bannon had misread the book, but he didn't. He read it exactly as written. Steve Bannon famously read The Fourth Turning 3 times. He made the 2010 documentary Generation Zero based entirely explicitly on their framework. He used it as his intellectual blueprint to deconstruct the administrative state when he was sitting in the White House in 2017. And the reason researchers flag this connection is because of one specific line in the canon of their work. It is arguably the most dangerous sentence they ever wrote. They state that during a fourth turning, leaders will, and I quote, invariably find one a threat and may even fabricate one to mobilize society.
You are taking that line out of its broader sociological context. They were describing a historical pattern of how prophet generations act when they reach elderhood during a crisis. They were observing that these leaders demand moral clarity and will often hype up a threat to achieve it. They were absolutely not advocating for the fabrication of crises as a political strategy.
But when you write a best-selling book claiming that institutional destruction is an inevitable, cyclical necessity for social renewal, that society literally needs to burn down its institutions every 80 years just to cleanse itself, you provide massive intellectual cover for accelerationists. The theory normalizes the manufacturing of crises. It tells political operators like Bannon that tearing down the administrative state isn't a radical, destructive act. It's just fulfilling the natural season of history. Bannon weaponized this exact find or fabricate logic. And when Neil Howe was asked about this in 2017, his distancing from Bannon was incredibly tepid. He called Bannon's politics unusual, but went out of his way to praise his cultural savvy.
You are completely conflating a descriptive sociological observation with a prescriptive political agenda. If a meteorologist predicts a Category 5 hurricane is going to hit the coast, you don't blame the meteorologist when looters use the storm as cover to smash store windows. Strauss and Howe spent entire chapters warning that the crisis could end in tragedy just as easily as triumph. They specifically warned about the distinct danger of authoritarianism emerging during a fourth turning. Blaming the analytical framework for Steve Bannon's political project is a complete evasion of the framework's actual grounded historical observations.
The problem is that the framework itself is broken even on its own terms. Let's look at its ultimate falsifiability problem. They claim this 4-archetype cycle, prophet, nomad, hero, artist, is an iron law of Anglo-American history, over and over clockwork. Except they admit it completely failed during the Civil War. The cycle skipped the civic or hero archetype entirely. No hero generation magically appeared to fight the Civil War. If your rigid cyclical theory completely fails during the single most destructive, consequential, and bloody crisis in American history, it isn't a theory. It's just a pattern matching game that you abandon the second the puzzle pieces don't fit.
I actually view that exact anomaly as proof of their credibility.
The fact that they openly dedicated significant space in their books to analyze the Civil War anomaly demonstrates genuine intellectual honesty. They didn't sweep it under the rug to protect their brand. They explored exactly why that specific sacculin was shorter, and they mapped out how the absence of a hero generation directly led to the catastrophic failures of Reconstruction. If the historical model holds true for 4 out of 5 massive, multi-century cycles, an 80% success rate in macroscopic historical sociology is frankly remarkable. It doesn't invalidate the model. It highlights the unique tragedy and deviation of the Civil War.
An 80% success rate is perfectly fine if you're claiming a general loose tendency. But they don't do that. They claim this is an immutable seasonal clock. Winter is coming, they say, as if it's astrophysics. You cannot claim the precision of celestial mechanics to sell books, and then just shrug off a 20% failure rate as a quirky anomaly. And that brings us back to the ultimate verdict on moods versus events. When the specific, testable predictions fail, like unionization, inequality, or the 2025 deadline we started with, they retreat to the safest possible ground. They say, well, we successfully predicted the mood of the 2020s.
They retreat to that ground because the mood is what actually matters. The underlying social psychology of an era dictates exactly what legislation is possible and what institutions can survive. They correctly saw decades in advance that the 2020s would be an era where the fundamental legitimacy of our institutions would be aggressively questioned from both the left and the right. They saw the mood of zero-sum existential politics coming long before it arrived.
Predicting a bad mood over a 20-year window is a parlor trick. If I tell you that sometime in the next 20 years you will experience a major personal crisis, and then you happen to get divorced 10 years later, I'm not a prophet. I just understand the statistical inevitability of human suffering over a long enough timeline. That's exactly what this book does on a macro-national scale. It packages the sheer inevitability of historical friction into a highly lucrative corporate consulting model.
I think we have reached the core tension of our discussion today, which means it is time for our honest takeaways. For anyone listening who wants to engage with this material, here is a concrete reading strategy. You should absolutely read their 1991 book, Generations, specifically Part 2. The generational biographies they wrote there, especially Chapter 10 on the silent generation, are absolute masterpieces of popular social history. They capture the deep nuances of cohort psychology brilliantly. You can also read The Fourth Turning from 1997, but read it purely as a historical artifact to understand the political playbook of the 2010s. The framework has genuine utility if you treat it as a sociological heuristic rather than a magical prophecy.
My takeaway is far more blunt. Skip their 2023 follow-up book. The Fourth Turning is here entirely. Do not waste your time. It is essentially 50% recycled material from the 1997 original. It quietly shifts the goalposts of their failed predictions all the way to the 2030s without omitting error, and it reads exactly like a corporate consultant taking a completely unearned victory lap. It drops the pretense of rigorous science entirely by the epilogue. If you want to understand history, read historians. Don't read a horoscope written by a satirist and a consultant.
We will be diving deeper into all of this in the lesson series coming up, exploring the specifics of the generational diagonal and the mechanics of the endowment cycle in much more detail.
And we will leave the final verdict to you, the listener. You have to decide if the undeniable power of their shared historical narrative outweighs the danger of what is, essentially, corporate astrology. Thanks for being here. Subscribe, leave a comment with your take. Check the description for the book link. See you next time.